Hi, I'm Dana Brown, Xojo's Director of Marketing. In this tutorial, we're going to see how we can create PDF thumbnails on iOS. That's the ability to create picture objects from any page of any PDF document you can access in your iOS app as a folder item. As you can see in the running example app, we are about to get the number of pages from the reference PDF folder item, and these had been added to a table control as a total of 291 rows. And if we tap or click on any of these rows, our example app will display the thumbnail for that page in the upper image viewer control. Observe how fast the app creates and displays the thumbnail for the selected row. How can we do this? This is what we're going to see next. In order to achieve this, we need to use the declare statement. This is one of the powerful Xojo programming language features that allows us to access the classes and functions available in the underlying OS frameworks, in this case, the frameworks for iOS. As you can see here, in the method responsible for getting the number of pages for a PDF document, we can use the declare statement, giving the same name of the function as is in the underlying framework, so we can use it with the same name later from our Xojo code. How can we know the function signature we need to use in a declare? If we take the name of this function, that is the one responsible for getting the number of pages from a PDF document, then we only need to go to the Apple Developer Documentation website and type in a search for that function name. And then we'll be able to see what is the right signature. We can see that it returns a size T type, that is an integer, and that it expects a reference to a Cgpdf document object as a parameter. Everything related to an object or reference to an object in the native framework, in this case for iOS, can be translated to pointers, a PTR data type in the Xojo side. So we can see how this particular declare returns an integer value, passing to it a PTR value because, as we saw all the references to objects in the native framework, they are translated as PTR data types on the Xojo side. In this case, the PTR is a reference to a PDF object. Let's see what pieces we need to fit together to complete the app. The first one we need will be a folder item instance pointing to the PDF file. The second one will be a way to get the number of pages from that document, in fact, this method. And lastly, we need to create a second method that will be the one responsible for creating the thumbnail picture for the received page number and document. As you can see here, both methods have been added to a module in the project navigator named as external, while the PDF file has been added to the app resources folder using a build step. It is possible to add this build step to the project selecting the iOS icon in the navigator and choosing the next option, add to build settings, and then build step, copy files from the contextual menu. Then, with the just added item selected in the navigator, we only need to drag and drop the desired file to the main area of the copy file editor, or use the available buttons in the editor's toolbar both for adding individual files or the contents of the selected folder. For our example app, we created a total of 3 PDF files. Using the copy file build step, we guarantee that the selected files will be copied inside the resources folder in the compiled iOS app. We can select the destination for the copied files from the options available in the associated inspector panel, including also for what architecture or kind of build will be executed in this build step. Let's see now the methods added to the external module, starting with the one responsible for getting the number of pages from the PDF file. As you can see, it receives a folder item as a parameter, returning an integer value. Its scope is global. The first lines of code in the method are the required declares, so we can call some needed methods from the underlying foundation and core graphics native frameworks on iOS. With this declare, we'll be able to get a reference to a class from the received name as string. With this one, we'll get a reference to an NSURL object created from the received path. This declare will allow us to create a PDF object from the NSURL object received as a parameter. So the first thing we need to do is to get the native path from the folder item instance received as the parameter. Then we call the NSClassFromString function, passing NSURL as the parameter in order to get a reference to the NSURL class. Next, with the reference to the NSURL class, we call the file URL with path function, passing as parameters the reference to the NSURL and the folder item path as string. With the result from the last class stored in the path pointer variable, we call next the Cgpdf document createWithURL function in order to get the pointer to a PDF object that is stored in the doc reference variable. Once we get the reference to the PDF object, we only need to call finally to the Cgpdf document number of pages function, passing the doc reference value as the parameter in order to get and return the number of pages for that PDF document. So this is how we get the number of pages for any PDF document referenced by a folder item in Xojo. Probably the most interesting method is the one responsible for creating the thumbnails themselves as the Xojo Picture instance. As you can see, for that we use a lot more declares from the native foundation, core graphics, and UI kit frameworks. We're not going to stop to see each of these because we saw previously how to get the needed information to use declares, and you can also go through the comments in the code from the example project linked below. Maybe the most interesting thing to explain is that once we have a reference to the graphic content of the page from the PDF file received as a parameter, it's possible to create a native UI image object from it. This is the native equivalent to a picture in Xojo. In order to create a picture from that UI image instance, we need to get the data of the UI image as a PNG representation in an NSData object. Then we send a data length message to that NSData instance in order to get the number of bytes from the PNG representation. We will next use that integer value in order to create a memory block instance with the proper size. Now we will assign the memory block to a PTR variable that we will pass along to get the getDataBytes function, so the bytes in the NSData object are copied to it. As you can see from Apple's documentation, this function expects as parameters the pointer to the NSData instance itself, the pointer to the buffer where the bytes should be copied, and the number of bytes to copy. Once we have the bytes of the PNG representation in our memory block instance, then we only need to create a new picture instance, using for that the well-known picture.fromData shared method and passing to it the memory block variable as parameter. With these two methods in place, plus the NSRect, NSPoint, and NSSize structures added to the same module, and that are needed in order to pass along and receive these kind of values when working with the underlying frameworks, we only need to design a simple user interface from our iOS app so we can test this functionality. It's quite simple, an image viewer control in the upper side of the screen that we will then use to display the thumbnails and a table control below it. The first thing we're going to do is add the opening event handler to the default screen 1 item. Next, we also add a folder item property to the same item that will store a reference to the PDF document file. So the first thing our code does in the opening event is declare a string variable, storing the name of the PDF file. Next, we'll store the PDF doc file property, the folder item reference where we get by calling the resource method from the special folder class. The third line of code will store the number of pages variable, the integer returned as the result of calling our number of pages method, giving to it PDF doc file as the parameter. Once we know the number of pages in the PDF file, we will use a for next loop in order to add to the table as many rows as pages in the document. Last, we call the getPDFThumbnailForPage method, passing the reference to the PDF document folder item and the number of pages as parameters, so our app will display the thumbnail for the first page of the document every time we execute the app. It's important to notice that the PDF document pages index start at 1 and not 0. Let's now add the selection changed event handler to the table instance so the image viewer can display the new thumbnail for the selected row. We only need to assign to the image property of the image viewer 1 control instance the value returned, calling the getThumbnailForPage method. Observe that we need to add 1 to the row parameter. That's because the table's index starts at 0, while PDF pages start at index 1. And that's all. Maybe the most interesting thing to explore is the code under the getThumbnailForPage method. In this case, I invite you to explore the documentation for these functions on the Apple developer website so you can get more used to how declares work and you can implement them in your own Xojo apps. By using this technique, you'll have more flexibility in your iOS apps in order to select and display the thumbnails for the PDF pages instead of using an HTML viewer as the option to navigate the PDF document. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the comments below. And as always, like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you get notifications for future videos.